Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be painting this Bernese Mountain Dog, and I'm going to use a very limited palette. As you can see, I have some Burnt Umber, some Ultramarine Blue, some Cadmium Red, some Cadmium Yellow, medium, and some white. And I'm working on this 6x6 inch panel that I have primed with a neutral gray primer, gesso primer. And my reference is this beautiful Bernese Mountain Dog that I just wanted to show you how I do a quick block in and mix colors without fussing over them too much, without losing a lot of the life of the color and getting things kind of muddy. So the first thing I do is I look at my reference image and I decide how I'm going to fit it into this 6x6 square. And I really try to visualize, as I'm looking at my panel, where everything is going to fit. And the overall shape, I'm looking and I'm seeing that there's an angle of his head this way and then down this way. And I'm just looking and seeing how everything, like where is his tongue going to go? Where is his nose going to go? Where's his eye? And kind of make an angle looking at all the angles, relating the angle of the eye, the two eyes in relation to each other, the nose in relation to the eye, his mouth, his tongue. So his head is really kind of blocky and square to begin with. And I feel like I can fit it into this space pretty well. So I'm going to take first some Burnt Umber and I'm going to just roughly place those angles that I'm seeing. It looks to me like his nose is going to be about halfway, at the halfway point of the canvas and pretty much over to the side. So I'm just going to indicate with a few little dots. Definitely not worrying about detail at this point. And if I drop a plumb line halfway down his head, I can see that his eye is slightly to the right. No, actually his eye is pretty much dead center. And his nose comes up about here. And the edge of his nose comes over to about here. The eye is angling down a bit. You can see already that it's starting to take shape, and you start to just look at all the relationships. Once you have something important like the eye that you can gauge all the rest of your relationships. For instance, the part where his the orangey brown part of his nose kicks in and separates from the white, I can see that that lines up with the edge of his eye pretty well. And his tongue is going to be down here. And then I want to look at the angle of his muzzle and how it angles down towards his tongue. And I see that this is his nostrils. Again, his tongue pretty much lines up with the orange fur on his nose. And then his mouth, the edge of his mouth comes pretty far past. If you run a vertical line from the edge of his mouth up to his eye, I can see that it comes out to about there. And then his mouth angles down. You don't have to worry about curves so much, just get those angles in. And I can see that his jaw line angles up about like that. So just working on getting the big shapes in. And you can see how it's already starting to look like a dog. And when you have the basic shapes in, you can start to figure out where your lights and darks are going to go. And I just kind of sketch those in. Make sure that I don't have the eye too big. That's kind of a mistake that people make. His ear comes down like this. I love all this gray. He's outdoors, so his fur, even though it's black, is picking up a lot of reflections of the sky, which makes his fur look a little bit slightly bluer. I don't want to say blue, but it's cooler because of the blue sky reflecting onto his fur. Then his, let's see, his ear, the black part of his fur kicks in over here. So I think we have some good information about the angle of his head here. It's not really showing his other eye at all. And his nostril should be farther over, or either that or his eye should be further over. Let's look at, let's just blur this out a little. Definitely had his nose over a little too far to the left, I think. But the angle, you just always make sure to check your angles. let's see where that white part of his fur that goes up into his head lines up with his mouth here. And it kind of comes in about here. And then there's his orange eyebrow there. So here's his dark, here's where I'm kind of blurring things out a little. I need to redefine. As I am removing paint, I'm using a little bit of paint thinner with my burnt umber, so occasionally it might get a little too wet. So I can go in with a paper towel and just kind of sop up the little bit where it's a little too wet, because I don't want that dripping off of my canvas. Now I'm going to check the angle of his nostrils, which lines up with the angle of his eyes. So his nostril comes out over, so see, it's about halfway. Lines up with the edge of his head on the right side. Angles in. So I can start to establish the darker areas so that I can see where the darkest areas are going to be. And to get darker, I'm going to add Ultramarine Blue to my Burnt Umber. This will give you practically black, without using black. You can use black, it's just that black is really just a very low chroma blue. So if you're using black, the reason why you may feel like you get muddy colors is because your black is basically just a very dark blue. There are varying color temperatures in black also, but I feel like the best bet is just to mix my own with Burnt Umber and Ultramarine Blue, and that way I can get a really dark, almost black color that I can adjust the warmth and coolness if I need to. So I'm going in and I'm putting in my darker areas that I can see. And I don't want to use any white at this point because my colors will get very chalky. His mouth. He's got underneath his jaw. It's not very dark at all. I'm just going to indicate that because I didn't do that before. And I feel like I have this probably too flat, so I'm going to bring it out a little. I'm going to like fade that into the background. And the rest of his body is to the right of him like this, so that's going to be kind of dark around his tongue, which is nice because it will highlight his tongue when we get to that point. And then there's some sunlight. As his body fades into the background, we will work in some cool and warm and cool tones into the background, and some green tones to make him part of his environment. So starting to take shape here, and I think that I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue. Maybe a little bit more thinner. And I'm still looking for shapes. I'm not thinking so much that this is a dog. I'm kind of thinking about shapes that are occurring. The local color of his fur, as I said, is not, even though it looks like it's a solid, like it's a black to us, it's really, when it's in the light, it's got a lot of reflecting of the sky, but around his eyebrow here is darker. This is all going to get gray. Now I'm just going to squint and I can see, that I have my, making sure that I have my values in their correct places. Nostril. At this point, you can change anything that doesn't look correct to you in the drawing stage. You're always constantly looking at angles, values. There's an angle here where the white of his coat kind of comes down at an angle to the side of his mouth here. So the other thing with doing quick alla prima sketches like this is that you get to really work on your brushwork, and especially when you're working with fur, you really want to follow the direction of the fur that the fur is growing in. And that's when we start to build up paint, that's really going to come into play there, because it's going to really help to accentuate. Let's see. I think I'm going to start to indicate some of the orangey areas of his fur. So I'm taking the burnt sienna and I'm mixing it with the cadmium red and cadmium yellow. But it's too dark, so I'm adding more cadmium yellow. I'm trying to avoid white as much as possible at this point, just because I know that white is going to, once you have white on your paintbrush, you can always switch to a different paintbrush, but once you have white on your paintbrush, it's going to stay there, so you're not, you're going to want to use that paintbrush for lighter colors. So I'm looking at the lightest part of his muzzle here where the orange is, and I'm just gonna paint that value in, because it's not really that light. And I think I made a little bit of a mistake here where I didn't leave enough of an area, but that's okay. And still blocking in shapes. I think I'm going to switch and start to add a little bit of white now. Not too much. Just enough to get a dark gray that I can paint. I never really made this area dark. Around his eye, that's going to get lighter. Anyway, but it's still kind of dark. And then in between his two orange spots there. Above his eye is darker. Below his eye is kind of catching a lot of light. So I'm working these areas in because they're not like the darkest part of the painting. They're starting to get a little bit lighter. But they're still pretty dark. And up around his nose here. Noses are always difficult. Especially on dogs, but on people too, they're also kind of difficult. I just want to get the shape. It kind of comes down to a V. And there's a little bit, there's that pink, that really cute pink part of his nose, and these are all little details that we don't need to get into at this point, but kind of sculpting that shape. So from this point, it's really looking at relationships, value and temperature relationships, and that's where the fun part comes in. Making sure that his nostril and the nice thing about working on a gray background like this is that I have that middle tone established already. When I work on a light, on a white surface, things always look darker right away. So when you work on and this is like a number 5. It's right in the center of the value scale. And you can see that it's already starting to look lighter, the background, because when you start putting that, when you start putting colors in, darker colors, that gray starts to lighten up a lot. So now I'm mixing a darker orangey brown. As you can see, I still haven't put any of that pure white in, but wait, when you'll see when I do that how all of a sudden everything is going to start to come to life. So now it's going to need a little more yellow. So now I'm trying to get a little bit thicker with my paint because I want to start to work with more paint so that I can sculpt. When you're painting alla prima like this, I feel like it really kind of turns more into sculpture. Painting becomes sculpture. When you start to work with brushstrokes, and especially when you start to put the whites on, you can really build up some nice texture with your whites. Just adding more of these little bits of orange. He's got a little bit going on in his fur here. I'm going to move into doing the lighter area of his muzzle where the orangey fur is. So still not adding any white. And you can see that I'm starting to build up some piles of paint that I can have, that have different values that I can just kind of dip into, kind of like reserves. Yes. Adding some burnt umber to just tone it down a little bit. I don't want it to be like so bright. But adding yellow to lighten it instead of white, so it gets a little bit lighter here. And okay, I still want to put some more darks in. I'm not adding any medium to my paint, in case you're wondering, but my my paints are pretty. When you're working alla prima, you don't want your paint to be too loose. My brown, my burnt umber here is pretty stiff, but that's okay because I really want to build up some texture. I really want to get his fur to have some nice texture in it. So that when I start to do the brush strokes, you're going to be able to see how the brushwork affects your painting. So I'm just gonna, you can always lighten these darker areas up, so it's good to have just the right amount of paint on there, because you'll be able to lighten it up. Once you lighten it up, it's a little bit harder to go back the other way. So I'm getting, that's actually, no. Sorry if I sound I'm talking to myself. I mumble a little bit when I'm painting. And just gonna, so now I'm just gonna make sure that I have all my darks in where I want them, and that I have enough paint in these areas that I'm gonna lighten up with some of the gray sky, grayish color that's been influenced by the sky color. Just want to make sure that my dark areas are actually as dark as I want them to be. This area down here is light, but there's some browns, some warm colors going on inside there. Here on his muzzle is a really nice kind of a purplish gray. I think I'm going to have to add some alizarin crimson to my palette for the tongue, because my cadmium red is a really warm color, and I want to work with a limited palette, but I'm not sure if I can get it pink enough. We'll see. I can probably get it with some ultramarine blue in there. Okay, now the moment we've all been waiting for. I'm just going to put one little speck of white. Right, that's more than a speck, but so you can see it's very exciting how my lightest area is going to look, and how it's going to come to life. So, and the fun part about working with grays and with burnt umber and ultramarine blue is that you can adjust the colors so well to get whatever kind of gray you want just from adjusting the amounts of burnt umber and the amounts of ultramarine blue that you use. So let's try this gray around his muzzle. That's pretty nice. You can see that on the right side of his muzzle, it's very white, but it's also very warm down around the on the underside. There's light reflecting from the sky and from below, reflecting off of his coat. So now I'm lightening up the gray that I used on the muzzle, and I'm just adding that in. I think there's a little bit more of a curve than I have. So, and what makes painting so interesting is the interplay between warm and cool colors. So I'm seeing a little bit more of a cool gray on this side of his muzzle than there is on the other side. I can make two little piles here of gray, a warm gray with more burnt umber, and a cool gray with more ultramarine. So on this side I can go, I actually might want to add a little bit of my orange that I already have mixed into that. Because the burnt umber is, even though burnt umber is actually dark orange, it's also a lower chroma orange. And you can see that I have this really hard edge here, but we can soften that out. We don't want to worry about that right now. I think I'm going to take that color and maybe put it in where his tooth is kind of coming up over his tongue. And his teeth are also, grayish, and they're kind of warm. I guess I can indicate those. You don't want to have them too white so that they stick out too much. There's a lot of things going on in his mouth here that there's a lot of highlights and his gum area is going to be kind of a really dark pink. So you can see underneath his mouth there are two areas of grays. Just underneath his mouth there's kind of a dark, kind of purpley, it's not really cool and it's not really warm. I guess it's kind of neutral. And then up in his where it's going further back is warm, and then that becomes light. And there's a shadow underneath, under here, which is it's very warm actually. Yeah. And becomes kind of browner. It's very warm, definitely. And also underneath. Kind of going up to his tongue. So I'm seeing a relationship between that color and the color of his nose. So I'm just going to put this in, and I'll probably have to pinken that up. I want to go ahead and just put some of his tongue color in, just because I think it needs to be there at this point. So I'm using Cadmium Red and added some Ultramarine Blue. I think that will work. I don't think I need to add any alizarin crimson. This is kind of a a darker value towards the back of his tongue. And also back here for his gums, and I can make that even darker with some Burnt Umber. And try to put in, his gum. Might as well just put the dark areas in that I can get in there before I start to add too many lights. There's a lot of deep purplish colors going on inside of his mouth with the gums. And then as I add some more white to it and a little bit more cadmium red, it's a bit brighter. That's a nice pink for around the edges of his tongue. I keep saying his, I really don't know if this is a boy dog or a girl dog. Now I'm mixing somewhat of a middle shade to kind of bring from the inside of his mouth. And as you can see, I'm kind of going up into the dark area just to soften that edge. If you're going into dark colors with other colors, you want to make sure you wipe your brush so that you don't put that down into your next stroke. You don't really have to dip into your thinner because you don't want to make your paint too thin, but just make sure that you use your paper towel or rag to try to get all the excess paint off as much as possible. And now I'm going to take some more of my light color now that I have all the darkness out of it. And I'm going to just do a stroke. And I'm going to wipe it off again because I went into the dark area and I picked up some dark paint. So, but that I really like how it's going to soften that edge up. I've already gone around the edge, so now I'm going to do my stroke in the middle, and I got a little bit of junk in there. I just kind of go around from the other direction. Don't want to play too much with it, but I can blend it in there. And then I can, let's see, take a little bit of Ultramarine Blue, a little bit of Cad Red, and darken it up and lower the chroma with, that's like way too red. Starting to get farther away from the camera with my palette, sorry. Try to get a little closer. Yeah, I don't want this to be too dark of a color, but let's see. Also, when you're adding white to a color, you are automatically making it bluer because if you're using titanium white is a very cool white. So anytime you're adding white to a color, you are lessening, you're automatically kind of shifting the temperature to a cooler color. So you want to be aware of that. And I'm going to trail off, just like that. I need to lighten up the top of his tooth there. With a color that's like a little bit more of a warm, pale yellow. Not quite that yellow. But as I said, the more you add white, yellow is a good example, I guess. You'll notice if you are adding a lot of white to yellow and you get a very pale yellow, it also dulls it because you're cutting the warmth of the yellow. Let's try this. Yeah, that's not too bad. That's good, actually. Comparing colors, his tooth, comparing the color of his tooth to the color of his fur on the top of his muzzle, you can see that that's just the right amount of warmth. I don't really want to use like pure white, but the lightest part of his muzzle is on the top, so if I just add just a tiny bit of warmth to it, And I'm not thinning this paint down at all. I'm using Permalba, which is really like a very creamy, buttery white. And it's part of the reason why I don't have to add anything to my paints, because whatever, you know, also my cadmium. All three of these colors are also very kind of loose and creamy already. It's only my burnt umber that's very stiff. Right. So I'm going to bring this white down onto the top of his nose. And I'm also going to bring it down, because this is very light here, and I'm going to work that into the shadow that I already have. So I picked up some of the dark brown, but that's okay because it starts to become darker and grayer as it moves down his muzzle. And it's pretty neutral to me, like as it moves down, I think. It's not quite that dark though. But I can take my brush and go along the orangey section of his fur, just to soften that. And then make sure that I wipe all of that off anytime that you blend between two colors, so that you don't pick that up. And I'm going to go one more time with a clean brush, just to kind of, you know, give it some texture. I'm not looking for a lot of fur detail here. Going to load up a little bit more white, and this is where we can have some fun with texture, knowing that this is the lightest area and that the direction, you know, looking at the direction of his fur, we can start to build up a little bit of texture. As I take this up into his head, it's going to need to get grayer. So now I have a good amount of paint on my palette that I can wipe off my brush, make sure there's no, but I don't want to put it in thinner. I think I've only dipped my brush in thinner one time so far. But I'm going to take my brush and kind of wiggle between these two colors a bit. And that's going to create the gray. This is where you can start to really sculpt your colors. Cool. So I've got the whites in, except for down here. I think I'm going to go a little bit, take When I squint at it, I can see that it's not going to be as white and as light as the top of his nose, but it's still pretty light. So let's try this. I've got, this has a little bit of everything, you know, has a little bit of burnt umber to tone it down. It's got some ultramarine blue to cool it down, and it's got some yellow in it to warm it. So it's pretty neutral. And it does kind of get darker. Under here, but it should be a little warmer. So yeah, familiarize yourself with the warmth and coolness of colors. So this is good right here. And I'm going to bring it over into the dark a little bit and wipe off my brush and then go back for another brush load. I think I'm going to need a lot more paint here because I'm really starting to build up some texture and brush strokes here. And I'm going to want to mix in some warmth. And a little bit of blue for neutrality. And just kind of pile that paint on there once you've got it the correct value and that you want it, you can just, you know, just pile it on there. So there's this really light area that goes into the bottom of his tongue, which is really, you know, the bottom of his jaw. And that's really important as a compositional element to bring your eye back up into his face. So it goes into his tongue, and you know, it's the bottom of his jaw, so it's similar to the way the right side of his jaw is. But then it also goes into shadow as it moves back. And it's a pretty warm shadow, so there we go. So you can really see how this is starting to shape up. And, you know, actually it's got pretty much all the elements. I just need to put some grays into his fur and work on his eye. But one thing I want to do is take some dark gray, kind of dark, warm gray. Let's see, I'm actually going to add a little bit more orange to that. And soften this edge. Going into his mouth. Then I'm going to wipe my brush off and soften that edge with a little bit of a lighter, you know, anytime to try to avoid just blending between two colors, try to actually mix a third color, especially if it's a really contrasty color. and that's good. And then, since this is an edge, I'm just going to wipe my brush off and just, you know, soften that transition up there. So what else do I need? I need to put his little split in his nostril there. Yeah, and his nostril is really kind of a purplish gray. So I'm gonna start with a lot of ultramarine blue. That's probably maybe too dark. Let's test this out. I'm going to try to do this in one stroke. And I'm going to bring it around, down. That's not too bad. It's going to take a little bit of sculpting to the other side. Yeah, I'm going to wipe all that off of my brush. Just make sure it's fairly clean. And then I'm going to, actually I'm going to put a bit of gray on the side of my brush, and I'm going to go around and soften that one time. And maybe again after I wipe my brush off. And then probably again because I want to sculpt out this tip of his nostril. And then I can just kind of dot that into shape. And he has a little bit of a highlight underneath his nostril, like that. And it's pretty light here also. So there, the nostril's taken shape. I'm just going to soften this edge here between, after wiping the brush, I'm just going to soften this ridge. Now I want to shape this transition here, so, but before I do that, I'm going to take a little bit of gray and shape. It should be a little bit lighter. And well, it's softer. The point is, once you have enough paint on your panel, you can, you know, start to shape things. All right, I think it's a good time to start finishing up the fur, and I'm putting this gray tone, which is going to become a little bit darker as it moves down towards the nose. And then I can kind of soften that. If you compare the, the color between his muzzle and this right side of his head, you can see. And I also want to fix this angle. Here, it's much too angular. And it really needs to flare out a bit. Here, like that. So I'm taking kind of a middle gray, neutral. It's got kind of equal amounts, I guess. And I'm going to work that into this area here, and I'm just going to like wiggle my brush. Down into his eye area. And around, down. This is where you can not worry so much about cleaning your brush between each stroke because it's dark. And you can still, you can get some very cool textural effects. Let's see. Yeah. His eye, I can start to work on his eye. I'm not going to do a lot, but I do want to kind of define the edge. And bring some gray. So this is a bluer gray that I'm putting in because it's reflecting the sky, and you can see that it's a bit of a cooler gray. So now the fur really goes back and forth between warm and cool. So this is where you really get to play with having, fun with adding some burnt umber or even some orange to your paint to warm it up, or use your cooler piles of paint to tone it, to cool it down. And I'm following the direction of the fur and just putting those darks range of grays that are in there, softening this edge with brush strokes. This will probably be a good time to put the background in also. I'm going to switch to a different brush for that. I'm going to use a larger brush. I'm going to put a little bit more of his fur color, of his the rest of his body before I do that. And it's just going to be blurry, doesn't have to be any distinct. fur. You're not going to show the fur, each hair. He does have these whiskers that I want to put in. That'll be like one of the last things I do. Just making a little bit darker color, working it down towards the bottom. A little lighter. And this is where it's going to fade into the background because everything's blurry when it gets to the background. Okay. I'm really liking this, and I think it's almost to the point. I actually probably don't even have to put much background in because the background is already a neutral gray. But I think it would be good to put a little bit of a muted green. So I'm just going to mix that down here. And I'm mixing Ultramarine Blue and Cadmium Lemon, which right off the bat kind of gives you a muted green color. If we used like a phthalo green, it would have been really, really bright. But the Ultramarine Blue has some violet in it, which reacts with our yellow, so it tends to be muted right off the bat. So I'm just going to put this around his nose. And then I'm going to start to add some white as I go up. And I'm just blending it into his head. And also on the other side. Bringing it in. So then when I start to put the grays into his fur, I can just work it into the background. And it will blend really nicely. And actually, I'm just going to keep it fairly dark. I'm not really going to make it light because he has a rim of light around his head that is really kind of like a halo of light. But I do want some variations in, I don't want it just to be all one solid green. So in some areas I'm adding more burnt umber because you can see in the background that there's some of those warmer tones in the green leaves. So I'm just brushing this in with a lot of texture. And still keeping it pretty dark so that I can put some of those really light tones and blend them in. The crowning achievement of this painting is going to be adding the highlights around the top of his head so that he really not blends in with his environment, but actually kind of stands out from his environment. Because right now he's kind of blending in, I think. So I'm just covering that, but without trying to blend it too much. Maybe add a little bit of white towards this outer edge. Oops. All right, let's finish this puppy up. So I'm going back to my grays. And I kind of need to consolidate because I'm kind of spreading all my colors out here, and I really want to get some nice textures for this. So going back with my palette knife, and I'm going to mix some piles. Here's a gray that's a little more purplish. This would be used more for the parts of the fur that I want to keep cool, that are reflecting the sky color. And here's a gray that's a little bit more warm. Okay. Cleaning my brush off. And I can add white to this as necessary, because I think I'm going to have to lighten these up. So now I'm just going to take my colors and just paint the light areas of the fur. And some really light areas. Yeah, like this whole area up here needs to really be light. But still be mindful of your brush strokes. And always wiping your brush off if you're going to blend into an area. So since we're using more white, you want to blend, you want to clean your brush off a little bit more so that things don't get too muddy. And you can do things like zigzag so that you're bringing some of the fur texture in. Just do kind of short strokes. It's really, really fun to just work with that play of light and cool. I can see over here is a really light area, but like say up here, it's not as light. So that gives you also a lot of variation and interest. And you can always compare it to your lightest part of your painting, which is the top of his muzzle, and see if your value is correct. Because you don't want it to get so light that it competes with the focal point, which is his, his eye area and his muzzle. So I'm just pulling it out and blending little areas. Don't want to get too gray. And you lose your dark area completely, you know, you can always go back in. I want to do that here. Just restate the darks. Just be loose and free. Don't labor over it too much. The thing about this is that his eye is looking dead, you know. So I think that it's time to do something with his eye. So what I'm going to do is take an even smaller brush. I'm going to use like a filbert, like a soft filbert. I think this is a number, I can't even see anymore. It's pretty tiny. And I want to get that light gray that's around his eye and bring that out. And look at the angle. And there's like a really light rim around the bottom of his eye. And then he has quite a nice little bit of light going through his iris in the orange part. And these are just a couple of strokes that I'm going to be putting in because I don't want to overwork it. But I do want to make the top of his lid, that angle, kind of angles up like that. I want to define that. And I also want to define the angle that is parallel to it. I want to put that little gray, just a little bit of the white of his eye is showing, which is really what makes dogs so appealing, I think. And then it needs more of a definition between. And I'm using a really soft brush for this. So if a dog's outside, he often will have some of the sky reflected in the eye. And we can put that in. I use just kind of a grayed down blue. Not too light, not too dark. Because then I'm going to do a bright highlight, a bright white highlight. And my bright highlight is going to go right here. So there's something still kind of going weird about the right side of his head here. I need to darken. darken up where his eye is, right here. And bring that up. That's better. Then I'm gonna, let's see, soften this nostril area here. So here is where you can, start to soften things if you want, but I wouldn't go too crazy with softening things, because you want to keep some of those nice brush strokes. But this is where you can definitely get a little more detailed and sculpty with your brush strokes. But basically, that's pretty much it. I think this painting could be called done. What do you think? I could really sit here and play with it all day, but I'm going to add one more tiny little highlight with a very sharpened edge of my brush. And that is going to be right here. And that's why I like working with these long flats, because they give me the ability to use an edge get a very sharp edge, and I'm still going, but I'm almost ready to pack it up. Maybe bring a little bit more of a highlight down in that edge of his face. Perhaps sculpt this side of his highlight a little bit more. A few more little hairs, groups of hairs that will help define the texture of his ears. And a tad bit more dark in there. Soften this edge, transition here a little bit. Perhaps put a little bit more, I kind of feel like it needs to come up a little bit. The orange, and a little bit brighter there. Maybe a little bit brighter here. Also, I know I keep saying one last thing, but just kind of look over and, look it over and see if you've got everything covered that you want to cover. I noticed that this was probably still a little too dark and not warm enough. Now I think that's nice. And I can bring this shadow down a little bit. You can vary your brush pressure a lot and get really smooth, if you want to blend. Instead of using a lot of pressure, it's good to use a very, very light pressure. And I just noticed that he's got these little brown spots in his muzzle here that I think I would be remiss not to add, because they really add some charm and character to his face. A little bit more warmth under his muzzle. And now the scary part is whiskers. I'm always afraid to add whiskers. A lot of people will scratch through, which is good if you're working on a light surface, but I'm working on a gray surface, so it's not gonna, but I don't really want it to be pure white anyway. So I'm just going to take my brush and kind of make it into a very sharp, try to get the wipe all the paint off, obviously, and try to make it into as sharp of a point as I can, and just throw some of those whiskers in. That's not too bad. Oops. And then he's got some over here. I might have to dip a little bit into my thinner to remove some more paint. Let's see. Yeah. One thing you can do if you really want to is wait for it to dry and then go back in with some white, if you really want to do that. That's fine. But I really just wanted to see if I could do this in one sitting, in less than 2 hours. So I think that that's good. Thanks so much for stopping by today, and I hope you found this video helpful. And if you did, please give it a like, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.